It's loud enough that you can hear me. Thanks for your patience. I'd like to start by thanking you all for being here and honoring my dad and your support for Jesse and the family. And it really means a lot to us that you're here and supporting us. And I struggled a bit, of course, developing the eulogy. How do you sum up a whole life, especially one as long as Bill Hope's? And my knowledgeable advisor, Mrs. Sally, tells me that I should take as long as necessary. But I won't go on for too long, but about 15 minutes, so I'll appreciate your tolerance for about 15 or 20 minutes. I guess whenever we talk about someone, we basically project our own experiences, and our own experiences are taken through our own lenses and our own filters. Of course, mine are as well. We each have a different perspective of who Bill Hope was, and I'll share with you a few of my impressions and my ideas, and also try to tell you a little bit about some of the things that he did in his life that you may or may not have known about. Bill Hope was influenced by the world around him and the time that he lived in, and of course he also had an opportunity to influence those times in the world as well, and had an impact on the world. It helps us understand him if we understand the times. What he was is a uniquely good man, and that's something to the very core. Whatever else he was uniquely good, and as Mrs. Sally said, he had very strong standards and morals, and lived those day to day. Dad started life as Willie Hope on a small farm on the prairie in 1921 west of Saskatoon. He was the son of a hard-working, kind, introverted father, and an equally kind, hard-working, extroverted, politically active, and socially active mother. And both of those people influenced him, of course, and his four siblings. They had a profound effect on, of course, as all of us do, on his life. When he was growing up, the conversations in the family house might have been things like, how are we going to stretch those last few pennies to make it to the next harvest? And those are the types of difficult decisions that they made back then. But other conversations around the table when he was growing up were about the formation of some significant historical events of the prairies of Saskatchewan. Things like the formation of the CCF and the wheat pool, the credit union, co-ops, farmers union, and church initiatives, all geared to helping small farmers and workers through tough times and achieving social justice. At the age of 13, Willie was a full-time farm worker, and as a teenager, the gang he hung out with was a team of 6 draft horses, and he knew them all as friends, and he loved his horses, of course. He knew each of their personality, and 70 years after he worked with those horses, he could still tell you their personality and, of course, their names. And he was very linked to his horses and loved horses. The music that he listened to when he was a teenager was not on an iPod, but it was live performances of meadowlarks and red-winged blackbirds in the fields by his farm. So a very different, isolated upbringing that he had, but also one of community that he experienced largely due to his mom's influence. Farming the Dust Bowl in the 1930s was an exercise in survival and frustration, of course. There wasn't much room for a teenager's dreams, but he had them, and he anchored some strong ideas about community and strength of conviction, all taught by his parents, and plowed in by endless hours walking in the fields behind horses 20 miles a day. Lots of time to think about those values and those things, and they were very deep for him. He would describe his values as Christian values of democracy and freedom from economic oppression, and the rightness of the struggle of the little guy. For the rest of his life, he would choose jobs and contributions to those ends. At the age of 19, Dad decided that he would be part of saving the world from Nazi tyranny. To all but his family, Willie became Bill. And Bill was 126 pounds of wire and potential as he went into the Air Force. His lack of education, he only had grade 7 education at that time, his lack of education was overlooked by some people who believed in him, and he was admitted into pre-enlistment training and eventually became an aero engine mechanic, and then eventually remustered into air crew as a flight engineer and air gunner, and he flew Canso airplanes, or Kettling airplanes off the west coast of Canada, out of Queen Charlotte Islands, searching for enemy submarines. A tail gunner's life expectancy was pretty short in the Second World War in the Asian theater, of course the European theater. Dad had volunteered to go overseas. His posting was an overseas posting in the Queen Charlotte Islands, but he was destined to very shortly go overseas to Asia and work in that war theater. And the end of the war came just in time to interrupt that plan. And today I'm happy that it did, of course. After a life put on hold by 4 years at war, he heard of a program for veterans that allowed them to get a start by combining their energies and their efforts to clear roads and clear farms in the far north of Saskatchewan. Dad helped mold a new type of communal farming enterprise on the Riverbend Co-op farm at Smoky Burn in northern Saskatchewan near Carrot River. Dad put his shoulder behind this enterprise, and it was a bit of an experiment, and he applied his ethic and his ideology of getting ahead with instead of getting ahead of his fellow veterans. Dad's initials were W.E. W spells we, of course, so We Hope was a fitting mantra for those struggling farmers with their fates so linked together in their communal farm. And it was quite a thing, a real historical movement in Saskatchewan and Canada. To Dad, hard work was something to be relished, and he had very high tolerance for working in the heat, and he was happiest with his shirt off when he was working up a sweat. He spent many days of his life working under the hot sun. To him, fields of stones were opportunities to turn them into fields without stones. The co-op farm eventually broke up, and Dad saw this as a failure, but it was really a success in many ways. It gave them all a start, and they forged bonds of friendship that lasted a lifetime. Dad often said that he only had a grade 7 education, but as an adult he achieved his grade 12 and a diploma at the University of Saskatchewan School of Agriculture. But he always thought of himself as being a little bit undereducated. This might have been a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but it also inspired him to be a self-taught learner, self-learner, and he read quite a bit. But his preferred way of learning was talking to other people, and more to the point, listening to other people. And he had a knack for having people be comfortable and tell him what they knew. And if you do that for 90 years, you become pretty well educated. And Dad had quite an education thanks to a lot of the people around him all his life. Shortly after Smoky Burn, Dad moved to Saskatoon with his new wife Nita and began raising 2 sons. They bought a fixer-upper house in Sutherland with a big yard where Dad satisfied his need to grow things. He worked at the Centre for Community Studies, a University of Saskatchewan think tank and research group that studied rural communities in Saskatchewan. He was just a research technician, but he was surrounded by professors and doctors of sociology and who saw something in him and accepted him as a colleague. And they became his mentors and his lifelong friends. They benefited by his ability to speak the language of farmers and to understand the language of farmers. And Dad certainly had that language figured out. Dad cemented his social democratic thinking under the influence of some distinguished scholars of the time, and a very unique opportunity where things came together for Dad that way. Dad had a way with kids, and we had lots of fun with him when we were little. We had our own invented language and lots of active play. Dad's bedtime stories tapped our imaginations about when he was a little boy, or when he was at Smoky Burn or in the Air Force, and we lived those stories with him. Dad had the biggest shoes in the world, and he was the tallest person in the world, of course. And when he picked us up to his shoulders, it was like blasting to the moon. And the view was incredible up there. Those are some of my memories of early childhood. The view was incredible. I could see everything. And when he'd speak to others and brag about us in our presence, it would make us puff up with pride and repeat that behavior. And that was often how he taught. He asked me one time if I knew what this was, and as he rubbed my ear, and I said no, and he says, "It means I love you." I guess I already knew that. Guys in the 60s didn't use the L word very much, and but Dad just about rubbed our ears off. After the breakup of his marriage, he continued to be there for us on every second weekend, and at hockey games and school plays and summer holidays. And then I moved in with him full time when I was 11 years old. Quite a shock for a guy who'd been single for quite a few years, and to have an 11 or 12-year-old lined up on his doorstep. But he continued to be a very supporting and loving father, and we batched pretty effectively for quite a few years. Dad was all about the lessons to be learned, and he would ask us what we thought about the clipping that he clipped out of the newspaper or the Reader's Digest. And on Sunday morning, we'd listen to the sermon on the radio, and he'd ask us, what was the message there? What did you think about that? And we'd have to work through that and articulate what the message was. He had a personal story for every example or for every concept. And many of those stories I could recite to you today, word for word, the way Dad told those stories, and each of them had some sort of message for us to be told that were driven in. We boycotted green grapes in protest of apartheid, and we didn't eat Kraft dinner for years because of the way that they were treating producers, and those were the types of things how we lived. Dad had a real appreciation for the land and an understanding of nature, the natural world. We picked crocuses in the springtime, and in the fall he'd take a head of wheat and thrash it in his hands and blow the chaff out and look at the kernels and inspect them and maybe pop them in his mouth. And he'd make the meadowlarks sing by whistling to them. Remember that? He'd wet his lips and go, and they'd answer back. And it was pure magic to me as a kid that happened. The aromatic pasture sage that he crushed between his fingers and put in our pockets was called Danny Mel, and that's not Latin taxonomy. It's a kids' language version of Danny Smell, and it was I loved the smell. And as an adult, I became allergic to it, likely from hyperexposure. My dad's, as we grew older, my dad's relationship with his sons was punctuated by conflict, of course, like our many such relationships. When we care so much about what someone thinks of us, even small comments are taken heavily on both sides of a father and son relationship. Dad's forthright approach was often met by both of his sons' desire to repress the issues or an explosion of emotional backlash. We never felt his hand in anger, but when he wielded disappointment or disapproval, we felt its sting. Balanced by that challenge to do the right thing was a principle that can be characterized by something that he often said to us when we were little. He'd say, "But that's all right. But that's all right." Of course, another kid's language version of "but that's all right." And it was kind of a kid's version of don't sweat the small stuff. And it showed a propensity to forgive others and to forgive ourselves. And a very commonly used word for my dad, or phrase rather. Dad and Jesse always believed in me, even when I didn't give them much reason to. And any success that I have today is built on that foundation. My brother's philanthropy and courage and moral standards are a true reflection of my dad. When the Center for Community Studies dissolved by a swing in political inertia, Dad moved on to other jobs, including working at the Co-op College and the Farmers Union. Thanks very much. Is there a volume adjustment?